Good morning. Ah, I got to sit down for a minute.
Hey, Dave, we don't come this many for me at 10 o'clock. Just so you know. Just so you know.
Look how George is dressed. Talk about us overdressing.
You have the, is the power on your little thing? Good morning, good morning. Hey, who's ready for a great day today? Is anybody fired up, excited? You can clap. This is an awesome day. It is so nice to have you all here, and you're going to really be grateful you came. Randy, wave at everybody over here. Randy Ream, pastor at Stony Creek Church, and I'm the pastor here at Hope Church. We both have the dubious honor of having Gary and Dave, for me, as our professors in college. Randy, it goes back, just because he's just a year or two older than me, right, Randy? Not much, to William Tyndale. And mine was at Liberty University. So these guys have really impacted our lives. We're glad you're here. I think you know the flow of the morning. 10 to 12 is going to be Evidences for God's Existence with Dr. David Beck. You can welcome Dave from Boston University, his PhD, and Liberty all these years. We'll have a great lunch break, I'll tell you that. The ladies made homemade subs and chicken salad croissants and cookies, everything good. You're going to have a great lunch out either side. You'll make your way into our family center 12 to 1. There is a book table that will be set up both in the break this morning, the lunch break, and the break later. Dave has a couple of his books here on Evidences for God's Existence that we'll be able to have you order. So $25, you can order the book. He's going to ship them here. And Gary does have some of his various books here for purchase. You'll take them home with you. So there'll be a little book table over here in the back. But I just want to thank them both for coming. I think with my lifelong learning experiences at Liberty from the time I was a 19-year-old kid and first walked into a philosophy class, I shared with them this little story. At Liberty, you had to be bussed over to Thomas Road Baptist Church for prayer meetings on Wednesday nights. Some of you remember that, anyone? And it was a 2.5-hour excursion. But, and I am ashamed as a pastor to admit this, trying to get out of a prayer meeting, but if you took a religiously themed theology or philosophy class on a Wednesday night, you'd get 3 credits for the same 2.5 hours. So I first just walked into a class, maybe not with the greatest motives, and it was a team teaching thing with these two and one other gentleman. And I just fell in love with it and ended up doing a minor in philosophy. I've said to this church, Hope Church, many, many times, that when I went as a 19-year-old kid from a strong Christian family background, a wonderful church, but a lot of questions and doubts about my faith. It was through these two godly gentlemen here and some other wonderful theology professors at Liberty, my faith really took off. It wasn't the faith of my parents or really my faith. It helped me wrestle through the questions. Anybody else ever have questions or ever have doubts about life? Remember Thomas, he showed up with the believers the next Sunday. Remember that? He kept showing up with the followers of Jesus, and the Lord helped him through a lot of those doubts and questions. Well, I don't want to take any more of the time. 10 to 11 will be Dave's first session. We'll have a little Q&A, and 11 to 12 is second session on Evidences for God's Existence. Give a Stony Creek Church and a Hope Church and a DBI welcome to Dr. David Beck. Welcome him to Hope Church today. Glad you're here.
I want you to know that I made your pastor. We were just looking at his transcript. His first course with me, he got a B. His second course with me, he got an A minus. And his third course with me, he got an A. So, all right. You Detroiters like it hot, don't you? Man. I'm from Virginia. We don't bother with heat in the winter. So. Okay. The existence of God. That's our topic for the morning. Wasn't that long ago that nobody thought that was particularly relevant. But you and I live in what I call a functionally atheist society. When was the last time you heard the name God in the public arena? Except for at the end of State of the Union, where it's part of the formula. God is absent from television. He's absent from movies. He's absent from our education. He's absent from our science. He's pretty much absent from daily life. Except for when you have your devotions, right? This is a functionally atheist society, and we have a whole generation that has grown up. I mean, they may be Christians and they go to church and all the rest, but they have no clue where God somehow fits into all of their knowledge. He's a sort of religious belief, a religious term, but other than that, he plays no role. So, when I talk about the existence of God or the reality of God, my point is we need to be able to think this through and understand that God, I hate to use the word thing, but God is a real thing. There really is a God who is a person, 3 actually, and who is the creator and the sustainer of all that is. He is, in fact, an intricate part of our daily life. So we're going to look at 3, kind of 3.5, of the reasons why God is real. How we can know that. How we can make sense of the reality of God as a true, actual, real thing, person. All right? That's our topic for the next 2 hours. Ready to go? I'm going to talk about this as a case. You know the word case from the legal context. It is the word that we use. When we use the word apologetics, we're not talking about apologizing for stuff. We're talking about the Greek word apologia, which is the Greek word for case. It's what lawyers do in a court. They present an apologia. They present a case. We're going to look at a case for the reality of God. It consists of multiple arguments. That's the part we'll look at. Those arguments themselves start with pieces of evidence. They start with observations. When I'm talking to the current generation, I like to use the word intuitions. The current generation, all they know are their phones, right? This is life, right? I don't even have mine with me, or I'd put it there, but that's all they know. And the word for them is not argument, because they don't know anything about arguments. We talk about intuitions. So I'm going to talk a bit about intuitions, our basic feelings and observations that make life. Altogether, these form a conclusion that there really is a God. That's where we're headed. Argument number 1. Now, I have a very broad audience here. I know that I've got some of you who are sort of apologetics aficionados. You've read all kinds of stuff, but I've also got beginners. So you're going to have to pardon me. Some of you I'm going to bore now and then. Some of you I'm going to talk way over top now and then, but I got to make all of you happy here somehow. Philosophers call this the cosmological argument. We sometimes call it the causal argument. I like to call it the because argument. Everything we see, including ourselves, is the way it is, as it is at all, only because. There's a basic intuition here that most people, except us idiot philosophers, have never even thought about. Right? We just know, right, that nothing is the way it is apart from all sorts of connections, causal backgrounds, all of that make it what it is. Okay? This doesn't exist except for all sorts of things that made certain chemical elements into a plastic bottle, that got the water out of some sort of spigot, probably. I know it's really special purified water, but we all know this came out of somebody's faucet. This doesn't exist, nor does anything else here, including me, including you, apart from a context of becauses. That's where this argument starts. It's a really basic idea that everybody knows. You maybe haven't thought about it, but you all know that. Nothing we do in life makes any sense without it. We're trying to fly to Mars, but that makes no sense unless when you cause things to happen, they happen. And they happen according to a certain order. I mean, you can imagine this discussion at NASA, right? They're sitting around talking about how we're going to get to Mars, and one of the scientists perks up and says, well, you know, we've never been there. We don't really know anything about Mars. Who knows? Maybe stuff just happens on Mars. I mean, maybe, you know, we might just get there, land on Mars, and poof, the whole thing disappears. Who knows? Well, I would suggest to you he gets fired about a minute later because there's an assumption that we all make that there is an orderly structure of causes. The law of gravity may have different numbers on Mars and on the moon, but there's still the law of gravity. And everything works exactly the same way it does here. Again, the formulas might be a little different, but it's the same thing. That's where this argument starts. Now, here's the key to the argument. This can't just go on. A is here, bottle is here because of certain causes that made plastic bottles, certain causes that got the water, put the water in, put the cap on, so all that. But of course, those things in turn had causes. Somebody had to build the factory, somebody had to make the water pump, et cetera, et cetera. Those things in turn had causes, and those in turn had causes. I'm only here because my parents. They're only here because my grandparents. My grandparents only managed because of my great-grandparents. Okay. How far does this go? Well, It, it's uninteresting here. It's only interesting to scientists and historians, maybe, to actually count how many links there are here. If we're looking for a cure for cancer, we obviously need at least to go a certain number of links. The only really interesting question is, does this just keep going on? Let's use the technical term, infinite. Does this sequence of causes just not ever stop? The universe as it is, and the whole history of the universe, just is this unending sequence of causes. Either that, or they stop somewhere. Those are the only two interesting options here. Exactly how many there are, we're philosophers for today. We don't care. Right? Whether there are 2 or 2 billion is uninteresting. The question is only, does it stop somewhere or not? Those are the only two options. What we're going to have to think about is, there's a perfectly good argument that will tell us that they can't just go on infinitely. That this line of causes has to stop somewhere, or else we never get back to here. If history begins in the infinite past, now I'm counting on your 10th grade math here. If history begins in the infinite past, we never get to 2024. Right? We're still in the infinite years before year one. Right? We haven't even gotten that far. If there are infinite links in this chain, then we never get to the present. Nothing would ever happen. Now, I'm going to illustrate that, and we'll kind of finally put this argument together. But that's where this argument goes, that there has to be one final cause. And now here's the real key to this argument. If this has to stop somewhere, there's me, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great, my great-great-great, my great-great-great-great-great. I know, by the way, I know the names all the way back. Right? But look, if we get down here and it's just infinite great-grandparents, then there's no way back, right? This has to stop somewhere. The idea that there is a first human being named Adam is a perfectly logical and rational thought. It isn't really dependent just on Genesis 1. It makes perfectly good sense. Every historian knows that. It might be Lucy or somebody else a few billion years ago, but everyone knows this started somewhere. Because if it didn't start somewhere, we ain't here. That's the simple argument. That was a non-philosophical term, ain't. But we're not philosophers today. Okay? And what's important about this final thing over here is, well, the most obvious thing, of course, is it's the one thing that doesn't have a cause, right? If something has to be the very first, then it's the very first, right? And I've been asked this by atheists. Well, good argument, but what caused the first thing? I don't know what to say. First thing is first thing, right? Do the math. I mean, if it's the first, then the question, but what caused it, is nonsense. First is first. You don't get a head start on first. If it's first, then it's first. We're about to watch the Olympics. The starting line is the starting line. Right? You don't get a 100-meter head start before you cross the starting line. The first is the first. And then we're going to have to ask some questions now. What does that mean? What does it mean for a cause? We don't know anything about it yet. We haven't put the label God on this yet. We just know that for every event there is, everything there is a first cause, stops somewhere. That's all we know. But the one thing that we do know about it is it must itself be uncaused. It can't have a cause. And that's going to have some conclusions to it. We'll get there. Now, there are two ways to think about this sequence of causes. There's argument type 1 that is this all-at-once dependence. I'm just going to go straight to the next one. It looks like this. Okay, why isn't it working? Do you have to do something to that slide? There's supposed to be a little train coming out of that tunnel. The causal argument isn't working. Imagine a little train coming out of that tunnel going along the tracks. I've never had it not work. Okay? Now, the last car in this train is a caboose. And we could ask, suppose you knew nothing about trains. Obviously, you're not from Detroit. Suppose you knew nothing. You're from Mars, first time you've ever seen a train. How is that caboose moving? Well, it's being pulled by the car in front of it. Oh, okay. But how is that moving? Well, it's being pulled by a car in front of it. I think in the actual picture there are only 3 cars. But look, if the train is moving, now if the train's not moving, we don't have anything to explain. But as long as the train is moving, and the only thing you tell me is it's being pulled by the car in front of it. Well, that's true, of course. The caboose is being pulled by the car in front of it. That's true. But it doesn't help a lot, right? I mean, it is the immediate right answer. The common cold is caused by a certain kind of virus. That's true, but it doesn't go very far in terms of telling me why I've got a cold or how to cure it. I need to keep going. But sooner or later, something becomes obvious. Talking about the next boxcar just isn't helpful anymore. By the time we're at boxcar 2,576,423, who cares anymore, right? The next answer isn't going to be any more helpful, and by the way, we still don't know why the caboose is moving. Still not there. What do we need? Well, if the train is moving, in other words, if we're all sitting here this morning and there actually exist, if there really is one of these, then sooner or later, we need something that finally, once and for all, explains how we got to here. Which will have to be something that is itself uncaused. Now, I know within the limited analogy of a train, locomotives aren't self-caused, but look, once I explain to you what a locomotive is, that it moves automatically, we're done. I mean, yeah, I know we got to talk about the fuel. I know that. But that's the sense in which this is a limited analogy, like all analogies. But now we have an explanation. Once you understand locomotives and the sense in which they cause themselves to move, now we're done. And now you know why the caboose is moving, let alone all the other cars. There's nothing more to say. And if you were to ask me, well, yeah, but what's pulling the locomotive? The only thing I can... Hey! Thank you. I should start all over again, but I won't. So now you get the point. And if you ask me what's pulling the locomotive, all I can do is say, let's try again. You don't understand locomotives. The whole point of a locomotive is you don't need to talk about anything in front of it. It accounts for itself. That's the point here. Once you understand the connection between the universe and the whole history of the universe, now you understand about God. Now you understand that there has to be something. And it has to be something real, right? An imaginary locomotive isn't going to pull any cars at all. A virtual locomotive, that's a virtual locomotive. It isn't really pulling anything. Right? I mean, it looks like it's pulling something. It's not actually pulling anything. A virtual God, a belief God, God as a religious belief, he's not pulling any trains, nor is he creating any universes or accounting for what's happening in any universe. That's how this applies to the argument. Now, one of the things I want to make clear is there are a lot of people who think that philosophy and philosophical arguments, and maybe even arguments per se, and maybe even apologetics itself, isn't a biblical sort of thing to do. I've had I don't know how many students who came to me at the beginning of a philosophy course and said, Bible doesn't have any arguments for God's existence. To which I think the obvious response is, oh, yes, it does. You just haven't been reading, have you? There are plenty of them. And here's one, which is this argument, the because argument. Romans 1:18 to 21. By the way, I have underlined, the argument itself is in yellow, but I've underlined two sentences here. One of the things that's interesting is that at least the three main examples in Scripture of an argument for God's existence all have some component like this that make it clear that everyone knows this. And not only does everyone know this, they're held accountable for it. There is no good excuse for being an atheist. You can convince yourself of being an atheist, but there's no good excuse. Why? Because the insights, the observations, the intuitions that underlie these arguments are patently obvious. You can't miss them. I'm reading a book right now called The Hiddenness of God. And the problem for me is right up front. He simply rejects all of the arguments and then goes on to say, but look, in our ordinary experience, God isn't there. And I want to say, you're not looking. Okay, so God is not in the habit when we ask him to. I mean, I suppose we all think it would be nice, right? If somehow, when we needed to make a point, I could just snap my fingers and Jesus would walk in and say, what are you guys arguing about? Of course I'm real. Sometimes I wish that, but I didn't get to order the universe, so God wasn't listening to me at that point. I think there are perfectly good reasons why that isn't the case. But nevertheless, God is patently obvious in the effects that we see as we look around. There's no other way to account for things. There's no other way to make sense for things. Paul says that God has made it plain to them so that people are without excuse. Here's the argument. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, notice, not just God himself, but God's invisible qualities. So, we actually know something about God, not just that there is one. Namely, his eternal power and divine nature. They have been clearly seen, being understood, here's the key phrase, from what has been made. In Greek, that's one word. What has been made. The argument here is sort of backwards. Begins with the conclusion. Everybody knows there's God, and so you're without excuse. What we know about God is two things. He is the creator, the source of all that is, and he is himself uncaused or independent. The Greek word here is actually the word for deity, and the context, the connotation of the word deity in Greek is this notion of being independent, not having to depend on anything. In other words, to be uncaused. And what gives us this conclusion is this sequence of the things that are made, which is one word. The made things, or maybe even the madeness of the things. That's what tells us that they have to have been made. That was a brilliant argument. When you look around, what do you see? Things that have to be made, right? We don't get this unless it's made. That's what you see. Your front lawn has blades of grass. They're covered with snow. How do you get those blades of grass? Well, you got to make them. We all know the struggle. Every stinking year. I got to put some seed on the bare spots and play games in order to make it so that I have a lawn. The things that are made. They don't simply exist by themselves. They have to be made. There's the argument. It ends with the basic intuition and begins with a conclusion. Paul likes to get to the meat of the argument right up front. All right, before I go on to the next step, let me just stop there for a minute. Is there any question I can answer? This might be a good time just to make sure you're with me. I don't have a question. Oh, you just want the mic. Somebody way in the back.
Okay. In your original argument, it says that any first uncaused cause would have to be unlimited and infinite, and there could only be one of them. So
okay.
how do we know there could only be one of them?
Okay. Yeah, good question. I was going to get to that, but let's do it now. Because after all, you've seen plenty of trains that had 2 locomotives, 3, 4. How comes only one? Well, actually, the argument for this goes back to almost the earliest philosophy. What we know about this first cause is that it is independent, it exists quite apart from anything else, which means that it must itself be uncaused. Now we just need synonyms. Uncaused in Latin is infinite. Oh, well, that's exactly the point, right? What must be the case about this first thing is that it is entirely existent without limits, causes, dependencies, whatever. It must itself be infinite. If it were finite, it would just be another boxcar, and we'd have to add, well, but what caused it? Okay. Now, how many of those could there be? Well, the simple way to think about it is, well, okay, let's suppose there were 2. Let's suppose there were 2 infinite beings. Then, of course, you'd have to ask yourself the difference. What'd be the difference? If there are 2, if there's this one and this one, that could only be the case if there's some difference between them. At the very least, this one is here, and this one is here, and that one isn't here. But now, wait a minute. If that one isn't here, that's not infinite. Right? And we can pursue this down all sorts of alleys here, but the point is, if you understand the nature of what it is to be infinite, there could only be one. And since we know that that in the end is going to wind up being God, we're going to call this God in the end. What we've just said is there could only be one God. There couldn't be 2. When in Deuteronomy, God reveals that there is one God, the philosophers were all saying, well, of course, we knew that. There could only be one God. Now let's try a parallel argument. Could God have parts? Well, now the argument becomes the same. Okay, so God has part A, and then he has part B. Well, now you have to ask yourself, how's A different from B? But if God is infinite, A can't be different from B, and if A can't be different from B, then God can't have parts. Notice what we just did for you historians of theology. I just gave you the argument for the Trinity. There is some philosophy going on here. When the early church councils discussed the Trinity, they actually used these arguments. Here's what we know. We've got this biblical data that talks about Father, Son, Spirit. We're not quite clear what to do with that. Well, here are the parameters. There's only one God. That's parameter 1. Here's parameter 2. God doesn't have parts. Now you got to fill it in. Right? So the doctrine of the Trinity is our attempt to understand the biblical data and fill in the gaps between one God, no parts. Philosophy does become really important for theology. You can't do theology unless you think straight. And philosophy is just about thinking straight. I know we often mess it up because we're human beings. I've never known two theologians. I know that there are people who say that theology is inspired by God, and no, Scripture is, but not theology. I have never known, I'm 76 years old, I have never known two theologians who agreed about everything. That should tell you something. All right, so that was a long answer to but a crucial question. Yes.
Sir, I've noticed in my conversations with atheist types on the internet, which I have frequently, is the newest thing that they're doing is they're simply denying design completely. That there's no design in the world, we're just imagining the design. We're just thinking there's a design, but there really isn't. Is there any way you would answer that besides just saying you're a fool?
We're going to do the design argument in our second session. Okay. I'm not trying to put you off, but we will get there. Okay. I've somehow lost the time thing on there. Maybe when you got the train rolling it.
Yeah, I just had a question about the first created, over to your left. Yes. The first created would require a certain level of maturity to begin with because they couldn't sustain life otherwise. A baby bird needs the mother to bring it worms, so if it came from an egg, it wouldn't have survived. Adam and Eve only blamed God and each other because they didn't have parents to blame yet, right?
Well,
so there's this design
you can play evolution here all you want. I don't care how far back you take it. I'm being philosopher now,
sure.
Not Genesis 1 theologian, right? But as a philosopher, I don't care how far back you take it. Okay, so we came from monkeys and they came from... I don't care. Sooner or later...
You have to come to those first ones. That's the point. Yeah, they had to have come fully matured to a level to not require something before it.
Right. And I'm going to give you some examples of how current scientists just don't get it.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you're about 15 minutes to the first break. You're about 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Did you have one more question you want to take, or you want to go on to the...
Sure. Here's my question. If God had awareness...
Does he have awareness?
Yep, that's a two-part question. The first is, did God have awareness in his creation, right, in his inception or being first? And
yeah, we'll get to that at the very end. But let's just say at this point, if God is infinite, if he is unlimited in what he is, then he would have to be unlimited in his awareness, right?
So in that case, if he had awareness, what would cause the awareness, the self-actualization?
We could spend about 5 hours on that. But let's just say this. One of the things that we already know in this little argument, if God is infinite, then God can't change. God is what he is. I don't know how to say this in ordinary language. God is what he is all at once. He just is what he is. When he's revealed to us in Scripture as the I am, we philosophers said, yeah, I told you so. God just is. And even the word is doesn't quite follow. The word is, we sometimes talk about God as eternal present. Well, God isn't eternal present either. God is just eternal. God is just what God is, period. All at once. I don't know how to say it. Right? Our language doesn't work when we get into infinities. And we're going to talk about that in about 3 minutes. Okay? So I know I'm giving some short answers here to things that we could talk about all day, but we can't talk all day. I got to save this afternoon for Gary here. So, all right, type 2. There's a different kind of causal connection, namely sequences in time. Okay? Train connections are all at once. Okay? There's that kind of causal connection. But we've also, some of our talk here has involved time. Some of our examples have involved time. That's actually a different kind of connection. Sequences in time. So when I use child, parent, grandparent, etc., those are sequences in time, right? They don't happen all at once. Right? My grandparents don't give birth to my parents, and they, to me, all at once, right? There's some time that has to elapse in there. I call this domino type connections. Now let's see if this one will work. There we go. Okay. There's sequence in time. Okay. This is an argument that we call the Kalam argument. This argument actually originated with Islamic, Muslim philosophers. Muslim philosophy likes this kind of argument as well because they're committed to the doctrine of creation. I suppose that you have noticed in political connections that our greatest ally as Christians, when it comes to opposing evolution, et cetera, our greatest allies are Muslims who share with us a deep commitment to the doctrine of creation. And since they love this argument, it was developed by Islamic philosophers in the 8, 9, 1000s. It's most popularly done today by William Lane Craig. Some of you know that name. The actual argument looks and sounds much the same. We're just substituting here a temporal sequence for an all-at-once dependency. Okay? But the argument now has to look a little different. What we have to show is that there can't be an infinite in time universe, that the actual universe can't be infinite. Greg puts it this way. This is the simplest form of the Kalam argument I know. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. We've been there. The universe began to exist. Okay? Now notice, everybody agrees here. All the atheists, all the physicists, everybody agrees. Whether you think it's the moment of creation or whether you think it's the Big Bang, everybody agrees. The universe began to exist. But if that's so, then the universe had a cause of its existence. The universe itself can't be the infinite. If it has a beginning, then it's not infinite. But if it's not infinite and it had a beginning, something had to cause it. Can't just happen. Okay? So this is a slightly different argument. I'm not going to bother with this. I think we understood it enough, but maybe we'll come back at some point. I'll give you Craig's example to show how absurd it would be if there actually were infinite things. This example is called Hilbert's Hotel. It goes back to a British mathematician who's trying to show that the very notion of infinite object is nonsense. So here's the example. Imagine a hotel with infinite rooms. I've been to some big hotels, but imagine a hotel that has infinite rooms. And let's suppose all of the rooms are occupied. Infinite rooms occupied by infinite people, one in each room. Guess what happens? Somebody comes along, hey, I need a room. Well, I know we've got infinite rooms, but they're all occupied. Sorry, Charlie. Oh, no, wait. There's an easy solution. If we got infinite rooms, then all you have to do is take the person in room 1 and move them to room 2. And take the person in room 2 and move them to room 3. And take the person in room 3 and move them to room 4. And you've got infinite rooms, so we're good. So now 1 is empty and you can move in. Oh, and then somebody else comes along. No problem. The new occupant of room 1 now moves to room 2, and so on and so on. Now, wait a minute. Something's absurd, right? If all the rooms are occupied, doesn't matter how many there are, they're all occupied. Whether this is a little motel with 20 rooms or whether this is a big hotel with 2,000 rooms, if they're all occupied, they're all occupied. There's something wrong here if I can just add 1 every time. You all learn somewhere around 4th grade that infinity plus 1 is infinity. Right? Well, that doesn't make any sense. How could you add 1 and still have the same sum? Right? It doesn't work for any other number. Oh, but that's precisely because infinity is not a number. You can't just add 1 to it. You can't subtract 1 from it. You can't multiply it. Remember, teacher said, well, you're not even allowed to do division. I can remember, see, I was a budding young philosopher in 4th grade. I can remember sitting there thinking, how come? If you can add and subtract and multiply, although it's weird because they come out the same, why can't you divide? Well, the point is you can't do anything. Infinity is infinity. End of story. So, there can't be an actually infinite universe. And now we're back with the argument that we had before. Some quick examples here. Here's Stephen Hawking. Nobody better. He will go down as the #1 physicist of the late 20th, early 21st century. Look at this quote from his book, The Grand Design. Gravity and quantum theory cause universes to be created spontaneously out of nothing. Well, he has to say that. He's got nowhere else to go. But look how contradictory that is. How can nothing cause a universe? That doesn't make sense. Nothing doesn't cause nothing. I know, that was bad English. But that's bad English too. That's just bad logic. But what else are you going to say? Here's the current hot physicist. I don't even know how to pronounce her name. Paris. She was at Stockholm, is now at Cambridge. Before the Big Bang, there was space-time and energy. Now, wait a minute. I thought before the Big Bang, there was nothing. If there was already space-time and energy, then there was already a universe. It just hadn't become matter yet. But again, if you're going to refuse to admit to God, what are you going to say? Here's my favorite, Max Tegmark. I had a student a couple years ago who just got utterly obsessed with Tegmark and some of the contradictions that he makes. He's at MIT, again, one of our best. When we discover an object in nature, the scientific thing to do is to look for a mechanism that created it. Remember where I started this whole argument? There it is. Cars are created by factories. We know that one. Rabbits are created by rabbit parents, and solar systems are created, now look, from gravitational collapse in giant molecular clouds. I thought they came from nothing. So it's quite reasonable to assume that our universe was created by some sort of universe creation mechanism. I know that. It's called God. In fact, it's so obvious he goes on to think that there are multiple universes, just like there are multiple rabbits. Well, those are three of our best, and I don't get much. All right, we've already answered, actually, these questions. I think it's time for a break. And then we'll come back and do session 2.
Give it up for Dr. Beck. I know. There'll just be about a 10-minute break here. We'll jump into session 2, and then we have our lunch break at 12. Right down the right side of your hallway, there'll be men's and women's restrooms. Closer, down the left side, are men's and women's restrooms on the carport side. There is a table out here. Dr. Beck's book, Does God Exist? His marquee work looking at philosophy, religions, the whole world, and the evidences for God's existence, a history of answers to the question, does God exist? This is a sample only. You'll put your name and address down, cash or check, $25, and they're going to be shipped right here. We will get these into your hands. We want your name, address, cell phone number. And Gary, in the second sessions this afternoon, will go through some of his. There are lots of books at the table. You can take them home with you today, cash or check. The fee sheet is right on the table. My daughter will be back there at the table. Some real classic works. To me, Forever Love, the story of his loss of his first wife, is a gripping personal testimony dealing with doubt. Why is God ignoring me? The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus was one of the first textbooks I had with Gary at Liberty in an apologetics class, and more recently, The Historical Jesus. That's just some of what's out at the table. So those are for purchase to take home. Gary will say more about those in the second sessions this afternoon. And Dave's book, again, it's sample only. Don't take it off the table, but we want to get it in your hands. Will you sign those at home before you send them up here to Michigan? He might do that. Oh boy, he's not happy with me. But do you see why when I went to Liberty as a student, I went for one semester. I said, I'll try it for a semester. And I took philosophy classes, and I met some amazing theologians, and I was there, well, the rest of my life. Let's have a quick break. We'll be right back here about 10 minutes. He's going to jump into the next session. Books right out here in the hallway. Katie will be helping you there. Restrooms down both sides. Thank you, Dr. Beck. Looking forward to the next session. There's coffee right out in the coffee shop too. There is coffee right out in the coffee shop. A couple sweet treats, coffee. It's all free of charge right there in the coffee shop. So 3 to 3:30, 3:40, we can stick around and answer. We're going to welcome you back to session 2 with Dr. David Beck. There will be a lunch break at 12 noon. They'll be able to interact with questions during the book table time, and then even after at 3 o'clock today when Gary Habermas wraps it up. They're going to be here 3 to 3:30, so there'll be ample opportunities for some questions one-on-one as well. Just give Dave one more round of applause as we jump into session 2.
Thank you. All right, I promised this argument before, so here goes. We've done the 1.5. Now we do 2 and 3. I think both of these are a little easier to understand. And the first one especially, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with. Especially, I'm not going to give you a lot of examples because they're all over the place. We call this second argument the design argument. Philosophers call it the teleological argument. So it's an argument based on design. It's the simple intuition, observation, whatever, that the universe, our lives, have events and spaces, things, of significant design. I mean, there's some stuff that, okay, I mean, atheists want to say it all happened by chance. Well, okay, you know, there's some stuff that's pretty simple. Well, you know, we used to think it was pretty simple. It turns out there really isn't anything that's simple. It keeps getting more and more complicated the more we start breaking it down, right? We used to think that rocks were just simple stuff. Now, turns out they're incredibly complex stuff, and all we need is one rock from Mars, and we can sort of recount the whole history of Mars and all that. It's not so simple after all. But in any case, high mathematical and aesthetic order. The aesthetic part is hard for us to get a hold of because we don't know how to measure it. But I think on the other hand, it's sort of the most obvious. I mean, who hasn't seen some view in nature and you're just, wow. When I was in grad school, one of the most prominent atheists who'd written things against the arguments for God A few years later, went to visit his daughter, who was at Oxford, and they decided, well, we got to go see Westminster. So they went to Westminster at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And he sat there with the beautiful organ music and the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Have you ever been to a European Gothic church with the light shining through the windows? It's unbelievable. And he sat there experiencing that, and he said in his testimony later, I knew there was a God. There had to be. Right? It took him a while to work through the arguments and see where he had gone wrong. But he got there, just died a few years ago, became one of the most prominent Christian philosophers, Bill Alston. The probabilities of such design occurring, all by itself, exceed any possibility of occurring by chance, no matter how much time is available. You know that that's the standard evolutionist argument, right? Given it enough time. Look, we got billions of years here. Well, it turns out you get the probabilities high enough, time doesn't help. There was a recent conference of the Royal Academy, Great Britain, and one of the conclusions that they had come to is that we've got to rework this whole thing about evolution because we clearly don't have enough time. Something's wrong. The occurrence, therefore, requires an intentional, on purpose, creative intelligence. Now, again, notice that this not only tells us that there is a God, it also begins to tell us something more about him. We learn from the first argument that he's infinite, uncaused, and that in turn, of course, has all sorts of interesting conclusions. What in theology we refer to as all the omni characteristics of God, that God is omnipresent, omnipowerful, omniscient, right? All-knowing. All of those omni characteristics, they immediately follow from the idea that God is infinite. This argument will give us the idea that God is intentional, that what God does, he does intentionally. He doesn't just do stuff. Right? And he does so in a kind of creative intelligence sort of way. He is a creative being. One of the current views, some of you I'm sure have heard of this, there's something going on at McDonald's about this. It must be some current movie or whatever about the multiverse. The current view in physics is the best way to explain how evolution works is that, in fact, there are multiple universes. We just happen to live in this one where things... Well, actually, Christian theologians came on that idea very early on. Simply from the idea that if God is infinitely creatively intelligent, then this is the best he could do, right? I mean, this is it. I mean, there's some pretty cool stuff in this world, and it's getting to look cooler all the time. My favorite example is the platypus. I think that's God's greatest joke. It is the weirdest thing. It's sort of like, at the very end of day 6, God's got, wow, there's some odds and ends here still laying around, right? There's something like a duck bill, and there's this weird tail, and there's some odd things, and God says, well, put them together, and we'll call it platypus. It's a weird thing, right? But look, That's the best God could do. Early theologians thought too that there must be multiple universes because God's creativity is so vast that it couldn't be just this. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. Creates all sorts of interesting problems, but that's the point. What there has to be is some sort of intentional, creative intelligence, some kind of highly organized mind. God might be a good word for that. Okay. That's this argument. Here's where you find it. Well, there are lots of places where you find it, but I like this one in particular because here's another example of nobody has an excuse. Everybody knows. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. The work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night. It doesn't stop. It doesn't happen once a year, once a decade. Constant. Day after day, night after night. The psalmist, here's David. Imagine how many nights David spent laying on his back, looking up, with no light interference. Have you ever been somewhere like that where there's no light interference? No light pollution? It's incredible. Imagine what it was for David, looking up. They reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. And yet, their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. There it is. There's no God? Look! You blind? Deaf? I mean, really, even if you are blind and deaf, you still have some senses. Even Helen Keller got this. Their voice goes out into all the earth, even though they have no speech. It's loud and clear. There's the argument. Here's Paul. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God. How do you know there's a living God? Who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their way, but he didn't leave himself without testimony. He has shown you his kindness. We get to see God's love by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He has given you an organized universe in which you can live, that supplies all your needs. I know we occasionally have droughts. He provides you with plenty of food, fills your hearts with joy. There's the argument. Not just chaos out there. It's incredibly sophisticated design out there, and you don't get that kind of design by chance. Okay. This is Motor City. You all know. You can't just take a bunch of metal, put a stick of dynamite under it, blow it up. Whoa! Corvette Stingray. Right. I have one. The only car I have ever lusted after is the original Stingray that had the split window in the back. Oh man, I want one of those. You don't have. If you can find one, don't bother to pay me. Just give me the car. All right? It doesn't happen that way. You don't get creative design by chance. It takes intelligent input. And by the way, once you have intelligent input, it's pretty simple. I give you some categories here, but I'm just not going to bother. There are lots of things to be said here. The analogy argument, the most famous one, some of you know this, William Paley gives us this example. Actually, the example of the clock, Paley's example, goes all the way back to Socrates. As far as I know, Socrates is the first one to use this as an example. Paley says, suppose you're walking along in the moor. I never knew what a moor was until I finally looked it up. Moor is grassland, sort of hilly grassland. That's what moors are. Suppose you're walking along and you stumble across a rock. What do you think to yourself? Nothing? This is England. There are rocks everywhere. There are millions of them out there laying around. But suppose you're walking along in the moor and you come across a watch. Now, let's suppose you've never seen one of these things before. You look at it. This is old style watch. Right? Has numbers 1 through 12 around the outside. Has two little things that point. Remember those? And then you realize, after looking at this for a while, you realize that the way this works actually coincides with the sun and the time of day, etc. Both of them are right there at the 12 at exactly what we know to be noon. Curious. And then you realize you can take the back off. Remember when you could take the back off? And there are all these little gears and wheels and all this kind of stuff, and it's all moving. Right? Now what do you say? Well, what Paley says, here's what you don't say. Wow, isn't it amazing? What, given enough time, the wind and the rain and the elements and the ground, just let it go long enough, a couple billion years, there it is. Paley says, no sane person would draw that conclusion. Even if you knew nothing at all about clocks, just looking at that, you would conclude some sort of creative intelligence must have been at work here. That's a simple analogy argument. There are complexity arguments. Probably the best known of these are DNA, as using DNA as example. Well, the calculation is that a single piece, in order to get all the components of DNA, the probability is 1 over 10 to the 40,000. That's a 10 with 40,000 zeros. That's not even thinkable. What it would take to simply get DNA, let alone this. Right? Imagine what that turns out to be. Right? We don't even have computers to do that. We actually don't. We are currently working on mapping out the brain of the inchworm. Now, the brain is about the size of the head of a pin. It has, in fact, 350 feedback loops. And we think that we will eventually be able to map it out. The idea of mapping out 1 cubic inch of human brain is beyond comprehension at this point. We do not have anything near the computer power to do it. And then there are fine-tuning arguments. This has to do with all of the conditions. There's some great stuff if you look it up. Go to Wikipedia. I know all of your I've got teachers who are going to get really mad at me to tell you to go to Wikipedia. I know that Wikipedia is unreliable, but when it comes to philosophy, amazingly, Wikipedia, nobody does Wikipedia stuff who doesn't know about it. You'll find Wikipedia, when it comes to philosophy, really quite reliable, and you can get some really good stuff. Look up fine-tuning. You'll find all sorts of interesting arguments. What we're talking about here is the kind of conditions. I gave you some quotes before, remember? You can't get a universe without having energy, space-time, all sorts of stuff. Well, not just that. You have to have all sorts of constants that are in place in order for space-time and energy to produce what it had to produce. Right? There's a whole mathematics that has to be in place. Right? Tegmark will say that for us. At one point, Tegmark says that mathematics created the universe. Because in fact, all of that mathematical structure has to be in place in order for chance to produce a universe. So we call those fine-tuning arguments. Just some quick objections that'll help us understand this argument. There are lots of them. The most formidable objection, I think, is this, that there is, after all, only one universe, so we don't have anything to compare it to. We can't establish any real probabilities about universes because we only got one. There are lots of things to say about that. The most obvious is, well, there may be only one universe, but we still have lots of different kinds of things in this universe. What amazes me, there's a series in Nova on PBS about the different planets. It is unbelievable how different Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, it's incredible. And they all came from the same thing, right? It was just one big explosion and poof, there they are. It's incredible how different they are. Their chemistry is entirely different. The physics is, well, not different physics, but the physical calculations and numbers are entirely different. It's really quite unbelievable. We are perfectly capable of imagining how this universe could be different. The example that's used here, I guess we might as well, is the famous firing squad example. So imagine you're blindfolded facing a firing squad, and they fire, and guess what? You're still good. Well, okay. Are you able to decide whether this was chance, they just all accidentally missed, or whether this was intentional? Nobody really wanted to kill you, and they all made sure that they didn't shoot you. Do you have any data on which to decide that? No. You really don't know. But look, we don't just have one piece of data here. The real world is different. So let's imagine the other extreme. Suppose you're facing a firing squad, and they fire, and they miss. So they bring in some more guys, and they fire, and they miss. And so they bring in some more guys, and they fire, and they miss. This goes on all day long, right? We've now got thousands of people firing at you, thousands of times, and you're still there. Now do you have sufficient data to decide whether this is pure chance that they're all just missing, or whether this is intentional? It seems to me pretty obvious, right? Clearly there's something wrong here. Right? If you roll double sixes once, okay, happens. I played Monopoly often enough to know you can. But suppose you roll double sixes 1,000 times in a row. Oh, come on. You know what's going on. Right? You know that there's something wrong. The dice are loaded somehow. Right? This isn't chance anymore. That's the point here. Okay, so we really only have one universe, but the universe can be broken down into numerous kinds. Plus, we can imagine all sorts of conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Most frequent objection: too much evil. The standard objection to this argument is, you stupid Christians, you're cherry picking. The only thing you're using in your examples is the good stuff, the obviously designed stuff. Oh, yeah, Paul, we're all well fed, so there must be a God. Well, no, wait a minute, Paul. There are lots of people who aren't well fed. There are lots of people today who will starve to death. So there's not a God. That's the atheist conclusion. Well, again, we could spend a lot of time on this. I think the most obvious response to that is, if there's enough evidence, then there's enough evidence. Okay? It doesn't matter what else there is. So think of the lemon. I use car examples anyway for the teleological argument, and I'm in the right place. So let's say we go see the brand new 2024 Chevy Corvette, and it is it's incredible. What conclusion do you draw? Well, you have to draw the conclusion that somewhere in Detroit, probably right over here, there is a design team with a great deal of creative intelligence that put this together. Obvious conclusion. Well, let's suppose, now I shouldn't have used real examples. Let's suppose a year from now, some of you work for General Motors and you're going to kill me for this. Let's suppose a year from now, it turns out this is an absolute lemon. Numerous people have been killed driving this car. Lots of people have been injured. It's been recalled a dozen times. It's just a nightmare. Okay? Now, what about your original conclusion? Now do you conclude, well, no, there wasn't a design team. This thing just happened by chance, so it's not really surprising. Well, obviously this is going to have some effect on how you understand the design team. True, but it doesn't alter the conclusion. The evidence is there that there has to have been a creative, intelligent design team behind that car. And the fact that evil occurs is problematic for us. Yes, in the overall picture, we're going to have to explain why there is a good and loving God and evil occurs. I know that. But it doesn't alter the conclusion. If there's enough evidence, then there's enough evidence. The most pointless objection. I actually kind of love this one. Evolution makes God unnecessary. Well, that's like saying, where science is these days is sort of like this. Since I use Chevys, we'll use Fords. So here's this Mustang. That's actually an old one. I think that's a 65. Oh. How do we get that? Well, it's a simple answer. I'll take you right here, just down the road, to the assembly line, and you can watch. We've got this Ford Mustang. Why? Because there's an assembly line that puts it together. That's why. Well, but yeah, okay. So evolution, it doesn't. But evolution accounts for the universe and the design, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but assembly lines don't just happen, right? Somebody has to make assembly lines. And in fact, it takes far more intelligence to build an assembly line that will make Mustangs than it does to just put together a Mustang. You've only increased the need for intelligent input. You haven't helped this situation at all. But of course, assembly lines don't just happen. So we can imagine, suppose that we have some sort of computer program that's hooked up to printers, 3D printers, and all the rest, and I can take this thing anywhere in the world. I can go to the South Pole, put my stuff there, hook it up to the computer, wham! I've got an assembly line churning out Mustangs. I don't know what you do with them at the South Pole, but nevertheless. Okay? But guess what? That didn't help. Designing that computer program with all of the 3D printers and all the rest of it takes vastly more intelligence than just to build an assembly line. See, you've only made matters worse. So now we have a multiverse. Now we have Tegmark's universe creating mechanism. Right? Does that help? Nope. My point is, even if evolution's true, even if multiverse evolution is true, you didn't help anything. It would still take an immense creative mind to get this all going. You didn't help us at all. That's the design argument. Now, I got 15 minutes. Number 3. I think this is the easiest to understand. I think currently it's probably the most powerful. The problem with this argument is that most everybody thinks they disagree with the basic starting point, but actually they don't. The most famous version of this argument, I don't know how the NT got down there at the bottom, but is C.S. Lewis. This is a must-read. Okay? Next to the Bible, there are a list of books you've got to read if you're going to be a Christian. Pretty high on that list is Lewis's Mere Christianity. First 5 chapters of Lewis's Christianity are this argument. Here we go. There is a universal moral law. I told you, everybody disagrees, or they think they disagree. Okay? Say this, try saying this at the Democratic Convention next year. Whoa! I doubt you'll come out alive. All right? There is a universal moral law which applies to everyone. Whether or not people explicitly believe in such a thing, they appeal to it all the time. Lewis's point is, most people deny this right up front. And yet, their intuitions, the way they live their lives, demands it. I was reading, Gary, a paragraph in this book that I'm reading on the hiddenness of God. Here's an atheist who doesn't believe in any of this sort of stuff, and he gives the example. He's trying to show why God isn't really a loving God, and he gives this example. You got this bachelor who's living life to the fullest. He's living only for himself because he's got only himself. He's making lots of money. He spends it all on traveling all over the world. He's never really at home, and he's living life to the fullest. He gets married and has a child. Suppose he continues to live life the way he was. He's spending all his money on himself. He's constantly all over the place, never home. His wife and child are starving to death. He doesn't care. What would you say to that? Well, I find it interesting. He actually says it's natural and it's right that we think this shouldn't be. Well, of course. There is a whole list of scenarios here that if I said them to the person who denies that there is any absolute morality, they would immediately say, no, they shouldn't do that. Is it really okay? Let's go to downtown Detroit and rape every woman in sight, just for the fun of it. Really? No. You don't have the right to do that. This shouldn't happen without consent. Isn't consent a lovely word? Yeah, but see, consent implies that there's some basic moral law that we agree to, and therefore, if you consent, and if you don't consent, but that makes no sense. That's Lewis's point. That whole language doesn't make any sense unless there's some sort of moral law. We can't be ourselves the source of this moral law. Why? Because we all break it. And half the time we don't care about it. And we disagree about it. Can't be us. So the only conclusion, Lewis says, is that the existence of this universal moral law strongly implies that there is a moral law giver. And we call that God. So notice here too. This, by the way, is Romans 2. I won't bother to turn to it, but Romans 2 has that famous verse 18 to 20, somewhere there, where he talks about the law written on our hearts. That even the Gentiles who don't have the Old Testament still are accountable because they have the law written on their heart. We all know the law. Three objections that we have to deal with. It's constantly claim that moral standards differ widely. The fact is, ain't true. Now, it is true, of course, that we differ on all sorts of specifics. Lewis puts it this way, that we differ about the possible exceptions. Okay? For example, We all agree that it's morally wrong to simply take the life of another human being without proper cause. Okay? Where we disagree, of course, is two things. What precisely is a human being? Right? So the whole abortion debate has to do with, at what point do we have a human being? And what are the justifying exceptions? Because we all think that there are. Most of us think that war, at least with some definition, is a justified exception. Now, there are, of course, extreme pacifists who don't allow for any exceptions, but they are very few and far between. Even people who are pacifists and won't allow for war still commonly accept that self-defense is a justified exception. But again, we disagree about that. We disagree about capital punishment. There are plenty of Christians who don't think capital punishment is a proper legal remedy. Most Christians, I think, probably think it is. But either way, the point is you're talking here about a justified exception, talking about details, and yes, we disagree about the details. But we don't disagree about the principle. And Lewis gives a whole list of possible of examples here to which there are all sorts of possible exceptions, but we agree about the basic principle. Probably the most frequent one that's used here as an example has to do with sexual practices, in particular marriage. So go around the world. There are those who are monogamous who think that only one man, one woman, that's the only proper marriage. There are those who think that one man can have several wives. 2, 4, as many as they want. If you're the chief, you get as many as you. I find one is just fine. And by the way, my wife thinks that too. And then, of course, there are those, we got plenty of examples of those who think that you don't have to be married at all. Right? That it's okay between not just any man and any woman, between anything and anything. But notice, here's the consent word. We all agree that this is a special kind of relationship and it requires some sort of consent. And that's a universal principle. That there is some sort of privacy relationship that occurs here that is not to be intruded on. I don't care who the two people are. If you intrude on that relationship, there will be consequences. My wife used to teach 4th grade. 4th grade is when it happens. Still does. Somewhere around the middle of 4th grade, the girls have known this for some time, but suddenly I don't know what it is. There's something genetically, and the hormones kick in. Bam! Right? And suddenly the boys, ooh, there's something else. And all of a sudden, my wife would come home every year. Oh, guess what? It's that time of year. They're all going steady. Now, I have 4 daughters. You've probably tried this too. I have tried to figure out exactly what it is that going steady means. Right? What are the conditions here? I've never been able to figure it out. What I do know is this. If John and Sally are going steady, and John even looks at Mary, they break up. Why is that? Because the basic principle is intact. It's there. Granted, there are all sorts of detailed exceptions, but the basic principle is there. And I give you a whole list here. There are all sorts of basic moral principles, the law written on our hearts, that we all recognize, and we all do, in fact, agree on. It's often claimed that morality is a social convention. Well, certainly at some level, there is mere social convention, that we drive on the right side of the road, and that it's really quite unethical to simply wantonly drive on the left side of the road. Okay, that's social convention. There's nothing morally wrong, per se, with driving on the left side of the road. But look, at some level, we don't think that's true. We don't think that rape is simply a social convention. We make judgments about the way men treat women across the globe. We went to war against the Taliban because of the way their men were treating their women. We went to war over that. Right? And pretty much everybody agreed with us about it. Right? That's not social convention. There clearly is a perception at some level that there are moral rules that are not social convention. They are just rights and wrongs. That's it. We're at a point, it used to be quite popular among philosophers to think this. Gary and I were talking just yesterday. There's hardly anyone left among serious philosophers who still thinks this. Pretty much all philosophers agree that there are objective moral values. You just, in this world, you just can't not agree to that. It's often claimed that morality is just the current stage of evolution. Well, listen. There are a lot of things about our social conduct that could be explained by evolution. That we have certain feelings. When we see a child being tortured, that evokes certain feelings, right? That could be the result of evolution. That we have come to certain practices as a society, that we behave in certain ways. Yeah, evolution could explain that. There are all sorts of things about our social conduct that evolution could explain, and that's why it seems so powerful to us. But what it can't explain is obligation. There's absolutely no way for evolution to explain why it is that I ought not to. That it would be wrong for me to do. Evolution could explain that human beings just regularly don't do X. But evolution can't explain why it would be wrong. It can't give us any answers here. The only way to explain that is that there is some objective moral law, And the only way to explain that is that there is some objective moral lawgiver. That's Lewis's argument. That's the argument. That's Paul's argument in Romans 2. Been around for a long time. The ancient Greeks understood this argument. Even the Stoics. The Stoics were actually the ones who invented this argument. It's not a Christian argument per se at all. Actually, none of these arguments. They all predate Christianity by a long shot. They're just common sense. And they're based on basic intuitions. So what do we get out of the moral argument? Well, run to the conclusion. It clearly implies that there is some sort of person. The moral judge has to be some sort of personal source of creative intelligence. So look at all that we know. Here's our cumulative case that we were after. Let's skip straight. Here's the accumulated picture of God. Here's what we know after this morning. It's 12 o'clock. Here's what we know. There is something that is infinite. There's only one of them, and he doesn't have parts. It is the cause of all things. It's creative, intelligent, moral. That God is good, perfectly sensible insight. A person, and if it's a moral judge, then clearly God has some relationship to us. Right? Now, is that everything you wanted to know about God? Of course not. And some people say, well, philosophy is no good to us because it doesn't tell us everything we know about God or want to know about God. Well, okay, let's try this one. Does the Bible tell you everything you want to know about God? No. I've been studying this sucker for 70-some years. I got a lot of questions. I don't know who I'm going to sit down first, but when we get to heaven, probably Moses, and then Paul. I got questions, folks. And the Bible doesn't answer them all for me. Why? Because God is infinite. You couldn't possibly know. Do you realize, I would always tell my students, they had to take 2 theology courses. You thought you were done after you had Theology 201 and 202. Guess what? When you get to heaven, you get 203, 204, 205, 206, 207, 208, 209. After a few billion years, you're taking 20 billion, you're taking 20 billion and 1, et cetera, et cetera. We are not going to sit around strumming our harps. We're going to be learning about God. And it never ends. There's an infinity to know about God. So it's not a problem with these arguments that we don't know everything about God at the end of them. The point is, we do know some things. Not only that God exists, but we know some really crucial things about what God must be like. It does make perfectly good sense. Being a Christian is not being an idiot, it's being sensible. It makes perfectly good, rational sense. Do we still have questions? Is there stuff we want? Of course. That's all I got to say.
So I'd get to the end of 2.5-hour lectures on Wednesday night, and it just went by so fast. Thanks for giving us one more 2.5-hour lecture on a Saturday morning. One more round of applause for Dr. David Beck. I'll give you just a couple brief housekeeping items. The book table will be open here for the first few minutes of lunch. When you go out of these doors in just a moment, you're going to go down the right side. Halfway, you'll see the left entrance to our gym family center. If you go down the left side, just past the restrooms, it's just a quarter of the way, a single door. You can go on either side. Lunch is from 12 to 1. But tomorrow, just so you know, David Beck will be here preaching 10 o'clock Sunday morning. It's live stream, but it's also on our website, hope4macomb.com. hope4macomb.com. It'll be up there, right, David, on the website, the sermon tomorrow, because Stony Creek people, hey, Randy, they're showing up at Stony Creek tomorrow. But if you want to see his sermon, you ever wonder why your prayers aren't getting answered? It's going to be a great message tomorrow on prayer from Dr. Beck. Gary Habermas will be for 2 services at Stony Creek Church tomorrow. Hope people, I want you here seeing Dave Beck. But Randy, they can go to your website too. And your introduction of Gary at the 1 o'clock hour, share your website with us. So Hope people and DBI students, you're from all over, you can hear these great messages from Gary and Dave tomorrow. Right after the break, Gary's going to take us into the creeds and resurrection evidences. You don't want to miss it. 1 to 3, we'll be right back here. There'll be times for Q&A too. Thanks for coming. Restrooms, lunch, we got an hour break. The book table will be open a couple of minutes right now and in the afternoon as well. Thanks. We'll have a